So go ahead and tell us about your work and some of the exciting findings you've got.
I run a nonprofit pharmaceutical company focused on psychedelics and marijuana. And so our mission is to try to develop these drugs through the FDA into prescription medicines, and then develop hundreds and thousands of psychedelic clinics around the country, and then expand the use of these substances beyond medicine to legalization and religious use, spiritual use. And what we've focused on, though, is MDMA, also known as ecstasy, for post-traumatic stress disorder. So we did a complicated analysis of which psychedelic drug would be most likely to make it through the system first, and which patient population would be most sympathetic, that we're most likely to succeed. So we decided MDMA as the most gentle of all the psychedelics, and then we needed to pick a patient population that the bulk of American population was sympathetic to. And so we figured post-traumatic stress disorder, because the people that suffer from that, some terrible things have happened to them, they suffer from trauma, and in particular there's a lot of veterans that have PTSD. And so in our culture right now that kind of glorifies the military and veterans, if we could help veterans with their struggles with PTSD and reduce veteran suicides, we figure that that would be something that the regulatory authorities would be more willing to work on.
And so did you have any conclusions with MDMA?
Yeah. The first thing that we showed is that MDMA can be safely administered in a clinical setting. People have heard about ecstasy being used recreationally, and sometimes people overheating and from dancing all night and not getting adequate fluids and dying, or people have heard about people drinking too much water and then dying from hyponatremia from MDMA, or people have heard about panic reactions, all things like that. And so what we showed is that in a therapeutic setting that doesn't happen. So we're able to deliver MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in a safe manner. And then what we showed is that we had promising signs of efficacy, that it works. And we worked with the worst patients, meaning chronic, severe, treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder. And we did 6 different phase 2 studies in Israel, Canada, the United States, Switzerland. And all of these studies resulted in 107 patients that we treated, and we presented the data from our findings to the FDA on November 29th, 2016 at what's called an end of phase 2 meeting. And we were asking for permission to move to phase 3. And phase 3 are the final large-scale multi-site double-blind placebo-controlled studies that are necessary to prove safety and efficacy prior to getting prescription approval. And so the FDA granted us that. So now we're moving to phase 3. And what we then did was we entered into discussions with FDA and their program that's called Special Protocol Assessment, where you negotiate every aspect of the phase 3 design. And if you can come to agreement, you get an agreement letter. And what that means is the FDA is legally bound to approve the drug if the study gets statistically significant evidence of efficacy and no new safety concerns arise. And since MDMA has been used by tens of millions of people for over 30 years, we know the safety profile really well. And so on July 28th, 2017, we got an agreement letter in the Special Protocol Assessment. But then we tried to go even one step further. And the most important program that the FDA has for the most promising drugs is called breakthrough therapy. And roughly 2/3 of the applications from Big Pharma for breakthrough therapy are rejected. And so we managed to get it accepted. And I was particularly concerned about it because now we have Trump and Sessions, and they're trying to escalate the drug war and demonize drugs and demonize drug users. And I was worried that the FDA might be a little bit nervous about being so public, because when you get breakthrough therapy designation, if you're a for-profit company, your stock goes way up, it's very public. And so August 15th, the FDA came through, and they gave us breakthrough therapy designation.
Wow, that's exciting. That's unbelievable.
Yeah. And what I'd say even more unbelievable is that we have now raised $26 million from donations, $8 million from cryptocurrency just in the last few months, and we've started what's called the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. So we're trying to demonstrate a new way to market drugs. So not only are we demonstrating a new way for psychedelics to become prescription medicines, but a lot of people are very concerned about big alcohol and big tobacco, and big pharma, the way they market drugs and put profits first and don't pay attention to side effects, all their different marketing. And so we've created a public benefit corporation, which is a new innovation on capitalism, and you can maximize public benefit, not profits. So we've created a public benefit corporation that has only one investor, which is the nonprofit. So people make tax-deductible donations to MAPS. MAPS invests in the Benefit Corp. The Benefit Corp does the research and will get the permission to market MDMA. And then all the profits we make from selling MDMA will go into more research. So there's no private ownership or anything like that.
I really don't know what your angle is here, Rick.
Well, I'll tell you, my angle is the world is nuts. And, growing up in Skokie, Illinois, where, everybody was Jewish and being very aware of the Holocaust, and then, as a young boy during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the whole duck and cover under your desk at school and you'll survive a nuclear war, which was terrifying. And then I was the last year of the lottery for Vietnam, and so I was a draft resistor for Vietnam. So, at first it was the Nazis were, threatening me, then it was the Russians, and then it was my own country. So it just convinced me that psychological factors were necessary for human survival. I mean, look what we're doing with trashing the planet and nuclear weapons pointed at each other and, crazy people running America right now. So my angle is to try to sort of democratize spirituality through psychedelics. And I worked with Robert Mueller, who was the Assistant Secretary General of the UN, and his theory was that we need peace among the different religions, that we have the United Nations to negotiate between countries, but a lot of the real causes of conflict are religion. And he felt that the mystics of the different religions are much more tolerant than the fundamentalists of their own religions, and that mysticism is the antidote to fundamentalism. And we see fundamentalism on the rise, tribalism on the rise. And so when I was 18 in 1972 was when I decided to focus my life's work on psychedelics. And so now it's quite a few years later, but I feel like we're making progress, but the world is in a major crisis, so I don't know if we've made progress fast enough, but that was my angle.
Wow, this is fascinating stuff. So I remember reading that psilocybin, mushrooms, and LSD were being experimented with criminals, and it had, promising results. And then what happened?
Well, let me just say that the study that you're talking about was done by Timothy Leary at Harvard, and it was called the Concord Prison Experiment. And I did a 35-year follow-up to that experiment. Before that, I had done a 25-year follow-up to his Good Friday experiment, and that was taking 20 divinity students into church on Good Friday, and half of them got a pill of psilocybin, the other half got a placebo, and he wanted to see if psilocybin could facilitate mystical experiences. And what he reported on, and Walter Pankey was actually his PhD student, who was a doctor and a minister. He was the one that really did the experiment. They found that 9 out of the 20 people had a mystical experience, and 8 out of those 9 had the psilocybin. So in the 80s, when I wanted to do psychedelic research and it was completely blocked, I realized that doing a long-term follow-up, where you're just asking people what they think about what happened to them before, that's legal. And not only is it legal, but it's in a way more important than most anything that we could start new, because the consequences, the long-term consequences, are really important. And so I discovered that the findings held up for the Good Friday experiment, although Timothy Leary had hid one important fact, which is one of the people that had gotten psilocybin decided to leave the church. The minister was Reverend Howard Thurman, and he was Martin Luther King's mentor, incredible, dynamic black minister. And he told people they had to tell people there was a man on the cross. And this one person said, okay, I got to do that. And he ran out of the church. And Timothy Leary and Houston Smith ran after him, and they actually tranquilized him because they didn't want to go inside. They gave him Thorazine, and they completely covered that up. So I discovered that the basic research findings were supported, that these people reported to me that the mystical experience that they had under psilocybin, they still considered valid, even though many of them had since had non-drug mystical experiences. But they said that it was a little bit more difficult in a way, like an emotional roller coaster, more than sort of non-drug mystical experiences. And they also talked to me about what I thought was the key to the 60s, which was that this mystical experience, this sense of connection, and the loss of the fear of death, the sense of timelessness and transcendence of time and space, and all of that made them more motivated to participate in the social justice struggles of the day. So we hear about the psychedelic counterculture and how they were very much involved in the Vietnam War protests and helped create the environmental movement, the women's rights movement, all this. And I found that to be true, that these people were reporting that they had this mystical experience, they still considered it valid, and they were sort of motivated to be political activists, and that's what really caused the backlash. Right, so then I published an article about it, and there was an op-ed about it in the Boston Globe, and then I got a call from someone that said that they worked at the prison system in Boston and Massachusetts, and they had the records of the people that were from the Concord prison experiment. And they wanted to know if I wanted to do a follow-up to that Concord prison experiment. And I said, yeah, that would be fantastic, because Timothy Leary had lost the records of who the people were in the study. There was no way to do any kind of long-term follow-up on their criminal justice histories. But when I got this call from somebody inside the criminal justice system, he said they had a special room where they kept the papers of their famous prisoners. And the Concord prison experiment was pretty famous, so they saved all those records. It took us a year to get permission. We had to go all the way up to the Governor Weld at the time, in order to do the follow-up study. But as I started doing it, I started getting this kind of sinking feeling, because it looked like it wasn't as successful as we thought it was. I mean, I also thought that it was one of the most successful experiments in the history of psychedelic psychotherapy. And Timothy Leary also thought that if you can do research with mystical experiences, you're basically relying on people to tell you what happened to them. But if you do work with prisoners, there's a clear objective measure. Do they come back to prison or not? Have you reduced recidivism? And he thought that would be more believable than anything else. And he reported it as a tremendous success. And actually, he wrote a lot. So the farther away his writings were in time from the actual experiment, the better and better the results looked, according to the way he reported it. So when I started doing the actual follow-up study, I realized that he'd fudged the data and that it wasn't actually a success. And that I was able to figure out actually how he fudged the data. At one point, he was starting to say that people actually went back to prison more for simple parole violations than for new crimes. And that's why that was a success, because they were more heavily monitored by their probation officers because they were in this experiment. But as it turned out, that was true. They did go back for probation violations, but it was because they'd been arrested for new crimes, for which they were later convicted. So the whole thing was a fraud, basically. But I think that what happened was that Timothy Leary sort of left Harvard and became a social activist, and he saw how much propaganda was coming out about the negative uses of psychedelics, and somehow he felt justified to create his own positive propaganda, which is not appropriate when you're talking about scientific data. You need to be accurate and stick to the facts. Also, near the end of the experiment, Timothy Leary and the rest, Ralph Metzner, his PhD student who was working on this project, they realized that this experiment required something else, that you can't just have this, psilocybin experience and then send people out into the same environment that they came from, that you need support groups. We know that for drug abuse treatment. You can be detoxed, but you need support afterwards. And so actually they started creating a support group for the prisoners as they got released from prison. But at that point, Leary got kicked out of Harvard, and so that support group fell apart. So what I would say about that experiment is that it's very promising. It should be repeated, but it should be repeated in not like a one-dose miracle cure and now everybody's better, but more you can give people a fresh start. You can help them work through the traumas that have led them to maybe a life of crime. You can help them sort of feel more positive emotions, more pro-social emotions, but then once they get out of prison, you need more support. So I think even though the findings as reported by Leary was scientific fraud, it doesn't invalidate the whole concept. He had a brilliant concept that giving MDMA or psilocybin in this case to people before they get released from prison could really reduce recidivism. So I think that's an experiment that remains to be replicated.
So do you know how MDMA affects post-traumatic? Is there any kind of literature on that?
Yeah, there's been, well, what's amazing is if you go into Medline, which is the world's repository of scientific medical literature, PubMed or Medline, and you put in MDMA or ecstasy, there's over 5,000 different studies since the early 1980s. So there's an enormous amount of information. Most of it focused on what are the risks of MDMA, some of it focused on how does it work, and very little of it focused on therapeutic benefits. And that literature is all from us. But what we do know about how it works is pretty sophisticated, I'd say. So first off, there's a fear processing center of the brain called the amygdala. And MDMA reduces activity in the amygdala. So what that means is that you're not as reactive in a fearful way to emotional memories that come from trauma, fearful memories. People are more accepting of themselves and others, and they're not as triggered by the fear of the memories. MDMA enhances activity in the prefrontal cortex, where we are rational and put things in context. And also MDMA facilitates more interaction between the hippocampus and the amygdala, which is where memories get moved from short-term memory to long-term memory. PTSD does the opposite, that if you have PTSD, it changes your brain, and you have a hyperactive amygdala, so that you're always reacting in a fear to certain kind of memories, and then you have reduced prefrontal cortex activity, so you're not as rational, it's more instinctual reaction, and then it reduces activity in the hippocampus again. Now, MDMA also releases serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine in a complex sort of symphony of neurotransmitter release, which produces a lot of the mood. But MDMA also triggers hormonal release of oxytocin and prolactin. And so oxytocin has been called the love hormone, nursing mothers when you fall in love. And so oxytocin and prolactin are released, and they help create the bonding between the patient and the therapist, what we call the therapeutic alliance. So it's a very complex sequence of events that are triggered in the brain by taking MDMA. It would be very difficult to have sort of consciously intended ahead of time to develop a drug to do that. But luckily, we have MDMA, and now we've been finding out how it works, and that's been studied, some of it in animals already, which don't have higher level function, but it works with fear extinction and memory reconsolidation. So basically the idea is that when you have a memory, it's put together from different parts of your brain, and there's a part called episodic memory, which is about the episode, and then there's emotional memory about what feelings are linked to that episode. And for people that have trauma, every time they remember this episode, it comes with the fear related to it. And it's so strong that it comes to them in nightmares. They're triggered by things that remind them of the trauma constantly. But under the influence of MDMA, when you're feeling peaceful about the memory, we find that people's memories for the trauma is enhanced. Suppressed memories come to the surface, and because their fear is reduced, they're able to think about what happened, think about it in a different way, and then when the memory is reconsolidated, meaning, because it's not like what we normally think of, you take a book off the shelf, you read it, and you put it back. That's what we used to think about memory. But it's actually, you take a book off the shelf, you actually have to reprint the book to recreate the memory and to put it back into long-term storage. And so what we're doing with MDMA is shifting the emotion from fear to peacefulness, and from it's always about to happen from it's happened in the past. And so the episodic memory is actually increased because certain things come up from suppressed memories, but we're replacing the emotional memory with one of peacefulness, so that then the next time people recall it after the therapy, they can remember what happened, but they remember it from a position of peace and it's already happened. So we have a pretty good idea of how MDMA actually works for treating PTSD.
That's a really amazing. You must be, on cloud nine, right? I mean, this is all going your way right now.
Yeah, it is.
And, I mean, your way, I mean, humanity's way. You know what I mean? So
yeah.
that's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, I would say that what's even the most amazing to me is that we've just had a paper published in Lancet Psychiatry about our work with MDMA with veterans, firefighters, and police officers. So when we initiated that study, we knew we wanted to work with veterans. But just to sort of make a point to communicate that this was for the mainstream, we just added to the title, it's for firefighters and police officers. We didn't think we'd ever get firefighters and police officers. We knew we'd get veterans because there's so many veterans with PTSD from Iraq and Afghanistan and still some from Vietnam. But in the end, we actually did get 22 veterans, 3 firefighters, and 1 police officer. So we just published that in Lancet Psychiatry, and it was accompanied by a New York Times article. We gave an exclusive to the New York Times. And then it was picked up by Fox News. So we just had a 6-minute feature. There's Greg Gutfeld is one of the Jesse Waters. Mm-hmm. And so they had this discussion about MDMA that was 6 minutes, completely positive. And at one point, Greg Gutfeld turns to Jesse Waters and said, "Did you ever think we'd have a positive story about ecstasy on Fox News?" And Jesse says, "No, I never would have thought it." He said, "My head's spinning now, and I haven't even done MDMA." So we have bipartisan support because of our work with veterans.
So you getting pushback from Big Pharma on this at all?
No, we're not getting any pushback from Big Pharma, and I think there's a couple of reasons by that. First off, MDMA was invented in 1912 by Merck. It's off patent, and we just had a meeting to plan our move from FDA to Europe, and there was actually a senior official from Merck that volunteered to help us figure out how to go to Europe. I think part of the reason we're not having a pushback, I'd say the main reason is, first off, it's off patent, but secondly, they don't understand anything about psychotherapy. Big Pharma is all about giving you drugs. And I think what really blinds them to the fact that we're making progress, because people who are able to be successfully treated for PTSD no longer need massive amounts of Big Pharma's medicines, because Big Pharma's medicines for PTSD, Zoloft and Paxil, the SSRIs, they're meant to be taken every day for months or years at a time. And when you stop taking them, a lot of times the symptoms come back. So that's not such a good drug for PTSD, but it's a great drug for Big Pharma because big profit potential. Mm-hmm. So I think Big Pharma is sort of blinded by the fact that they'll tell you right now that the average cost to make a drug into a medicine is $2.6 billion. And they think, how could a little nonprofit ever raise that money? Which we never could. But we don't need to, because there's all different ways that number is inflated. And plus, I mentioned these 5,000 papers in the scientific literature paid for by governments over the last 30 years, almost all of them about the risks, and that is in the public domain, so we don't have to pay for that. But the other factor why I don't think we're getting much pushback from Big Pharma is the FDA has been set up to be insulated from pharmaceutical companies' pressure. Because if one company was able to successfully pressure the FDA about not approving a competitor's drugs, then they would get that back from their next drug. Other companies would try to pressure them. So there's kind of this truce where the FDA cannot even tell. If a reporter were to call the FDA, let's say you decide to call the FDA and say, how are things going with this MDMA research? They couldn't tell you a thing. So that Big Pharma is interested in researching drugs in secret to be the first to make it into market. So the FDA, if one company is researching a drug, and let's say they've discovered some safety problem that the FDA said, we are not going to permit this drug to go any further, then another company, for whatever reason, wants to do the same drug, and they start developing. The FDA can't even tell them that they've already looked at it from another company and rejected it, because that's the way Big Pharma has set it up.
It's a good firewall.
Yeah, so, and it works. I really believe it works. So right now, we have not experienced any pushback from Big Pharma. We have a whole team of what we call refugees from Big Pharma who are working for us in our clinical development team, mostly from Novartis, one of the world's biggest pharmaceutical companies. And these are people that cared a lot more about psychedelics than the drugs they were working on. And as they saw that our mission was to work through the FDA, they said, you need some expertise on how to do it. And so we have the wisdom of big pharma. And then because we've been so oppressed, you could say, in the early days, when MAPS was started in '86, psychedelic research had been blocked all over the world since the middle 1960s. It sort of petered out in the early 1970s. But we were, the first 6 protocols that we submitted to the FDA were all rejected. So it's taken us 30 years from the time I started MAPS in 1986 till 2016 when we had the end of phase 2 meeting. But the good part of that is that some of the people we started working with at the FDA have retired. And now we've hired them as consultants. So not only do we have refugees from big pharma, but we have senior officials at FDA who appreciated what we were trying to do in a nonprofit context and are now advising us. So we have expert advice. And then the other main thing going for us is that MDMA is an incredible drug, and it really does work for PTSD in our therapeutic model, and we're getting tremendous results. It seems like it's the best treatment for PTSD that's available.
Wow, this is really mind-blowing. So, just in general, do you think we'll see an end to the drug war in our lifetime?
Well, I do think we'll see an end to the drug war in our lifetime. Yeah, I think that marijuana, will be federally legal in the United States in 2025. Medical marijuana now has widespread support, up to 80-90% of the voters. There's about 56% of the voters are in favor of legalization. And what we see is that medicalization changes people's attitudes about the propaganda that they've heard about how these drugs are only risky and no benefits. So medicalization sometimes takes a while, takes a decade or two. So the first medical marijuana states were in 1996, in California and Arizona. So it's been 22 years since then, and now we have a majority of people supporting the legalization of marijuana. So we anticipate that MDMA will be approved as a medicine in 2021. Then it'll take us a decade or so to start getting, like there's dispensaries for marijuana, and people see that they're not connected to crime, and so we need psychedelic clinics. And we're going to be setting up hundreds and thousands of psychedelic clinics throughout the country. And so I'm anticipating that 2035 is when we'll have legalization of psychedelics. And I think we have a global recognition that the drug war has never been about drug abuse. It's always been about suppressing minorities. It's been about jobs for police and prisons, all these economic interests. It's been particularly about persecuting minorities, political minorities in different ways. It's never been about drug abuse, and it's expensive. I mean, there was a period of time in California about 10 years ago when the amount of money that the state spent on prisons exceeded the amount of money that they spent on public education. So I think the bankruptcy of that is coming more apparent to people, and the ability of the government to demonize drug users is harder. So right now, for example, there's a lot of stories about microdosing LSD by people in the Silicon Valley, using it for enhanced creativity. And so we think about America as the engine of our growth is innovation, science, Silicon Valley. And when you have those kind of people microdosing LSD, it's clear that there's some benefits to everybody from letting that happen. And so I do think that we'll see the end of prohibition. It's going to be a really long, failed experiment that's had tragic consequences, but over time, I think we'll see the end of it.
Well, I hope you're right about that Silicon Valley theory, because I remember Lenny Bruce said in the late 60s that marijuana will be legal very soon because all my friends in law school are smoking it.
Well, I'll tell you. So there was a fellow named Lester Grinspoon, who was a professor at Harvard, and he wrote a book, Marijuana Reconsidered, in the early 1970s, and he also predicted that marijuana would be legal in the next few years, before the end of the decade, actually. And one of his closest friends was Carl Sagan, who was secretly a daily marijuana smoker for 40 years, but he had government clearances for the space program, and so he didn't want people to know that. But Carl talked about Lester, and he said he disagreed with his book, And Lester was, what do you disagree with about my book? He said, well, you predict that marijuana will be legal by the end of the 70s, and I think you're way too pessimistic. It'll be legal in the next few years. So there was an over-optimism about it. And then what really happened was in the end of the 70s was the rise of the parents' movement, scared about their kids, and then we ended up with Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan and Just Say No and the escalation of the drug war. And so, yeah, there is some worry. Are we over-optimistic now after all these years? But I think society has changed in fundamental ways over the last 50 years so that kind of backlash is not likely to happen. So I think we will move into marijuana legalization first. We have the incredible opiate crisis in America with incredible numbers of deaths. Last year, more people died from drug overdoses than throughout the entire history of Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. More people died from drug overdoses in 1 year in America from all the years of those 3 wars. So there's a sense that this is under prohibition, that prohibition is not helping. We need to move to harm reduction methods. We need to offer treatment. We need to stop stigmatizing drug abusers, provide them opportunities for treatment where they will come without worry that they'll be put in prison, or, women that my father actually is a pediatrician, long since retired, but he worked on one of the very first studies on crack babies, because there was this whole big scare in the 80s about how crack babies were permanently damaged and we're going to have a whole generation of violent criminals. And my dad told me that his partners and he did the pediatric evaluations of their health. And he said that this is vastly overhyped, that these kids can return to normal, that there is really no crack baby phenomenon at all. It's related to fetal alcohol syndrome, to poverty, to other things, but it's not related to crack cocaine. And so there was this fear that was generated to kind of promote the drug war. And now we're seeing marijuana. I mean, one of the most important things is that marijuana is being demonstrated to have anti-tumor properties. Marijuana does not cause lung cancer. Marijuana can kill cancer in a variety of different cell lines. In Israel, at the Technion in Haifa, which is sort of Israeli's MIT, they're doing all these scans of all the different cannabinoids and terpenes against different cancer cell lines in the body, and they're finding surprising hits. We know that Sanjay Gupta has done a series of stories on weed, most recently about childhood epilepsy. He's done incredible public education. So I think even my mother, who's in her 80s and has a lot of pain, was willing to smoke pot for pain. So the largest group of people that are increasing statistically to use marijuana are the elderly. Yeah, so I think we're in, a lot more struggle ahead, but I think we will end the drug war.
Well, I could talk to you all day. I really could. What question did I forget to ask you?
How can people help?
Yeah.
Great question.
MAPS is a nonprofit organization, so we exist only through donations. So I think the first thing people could do is educate themselves, because we have been subjected to so much propaganda that there's still a lot of people that think that MDMA causes holes in your brain. Oprah had a show where she showed brain images of holes in the brain. There was completely graphically manipulated, fraudulent images designed to scare people. That was in 2001. And people that I encounter today, 17 years later, still talk about MDMA and holes in the brain. So I'd say, first off, people can help by educating themselves. Go to the MAPS website, which is maps.org, and we have all sorts of information about there. And then if they want to donate, that would be great. We'd very much appreciate it. And then I think also people can pressure their members of Congress, because the political struggle now, we have an open door for psychedelic research, but surprisingly, we're being blocked with marijuana research. And the reason is because there's a federal monopoly on the supply of DEA-licensed marijuana. So that's been in existence since 1968. The University of Mississippi grows marijuana under contract to the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And that marijuana can be used for research, but not for commercial sales. So what that means is phase 3, which is the final stage of research that we're moving into for MDMA, you have to use the exact same dosage form and drug that you want to market. And because we have the monopoly on marijuana, we can never do phase 3 studies. That's the way that the federal government and the DEA have blocked marijuana from becoming a medicine. But that's coming to an end, I think. So the DEA is now ready to end the monopoly. The National Institute on Drug Abuse is ready to end the monopoly, but Attorney General Sessions is blocking them. And so Senator Orrin Hatch, Senator Kamala Harris, Senator Gillibrand, Senator Warren, all sorts of senators have been pressuring Sessions to start licensing some firms. There was just an article in Business Week that the title of it was "America is Losing a $30 Billion Industry in Marijuana by Blocking Private Production." So I think people can pressure their members of Congress to pressure Sessions to let this monopoly end, and that's how people can help.
Wow, that was great. Thanks for taking time.
Hey, this is the part where I tell you where our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then I would tell you to go join our premium, but nobody has a fucking job. So why don't you just enjoy the video?